Hello everyone, I'm Quentin Dempster, a has-been journalist. This webinar, Subs and Secrets, is being hosted by Australians for War Powers Reform, a civil society think tank which is campaigning for a major change in the way this country goes to war, putting Australia's sons and daughters of our defence forces in harm's way and making Australia a big target for attack. AWPR wants any declaration of war to be by a vote of our representative parliament with clearly stated defensive justifications, not on the behind the closed doors say-so of one political party leader who happens to be Prime Minister. This is particularly pertinent today because of fears that the United States and therefore Australia may soon be at war with China over Taiwan. We're going to talk about Aukus, Australia, United Kingdom and the United States and the Labor and Liberal National Party's bipartisan agreement to spend $368 billion on the manufacture, supply and operation of nuclear-propelled submarines, a shining symbol of what is called our deterrence strategy, with, it is claimed, no impact on Australia's sovereignty or independence. Now, if you want to ask a question, don't forget to use the Q&A feature, not the chat feature, the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to ask pertinent questions, which I hope we'll have time for. And here to discuss Aukus are three great Australians. Please welcome Andrew Fowler, journalist and author of Nuked. I'm holding it up. Nuked, the submarine fiasco that sank Australia's sovereignty. Andrew has just won this year's Walkley Book Award for Nuked. Congratulations, Andrew.
Thanks very much, Quentin.
Please welcome Kellie Tranter. Kellie is a lawyer, a researcher, an analyst, and a human rights activist. Kellie writes for Declassified Australia and other publications, including John Menadew's Pearls and Irritations. Hello, Kellie.
Hi, Quentin. Good to be with you.
And please welcome Rex Patrick. Rex is a former senator for South Australia, a dogged freedom of information litigant, now running an outfit called Transparency Warrior. Rex is standing again for the Senate in South Australia under the Jackie Lambie network. We hope you get there, Rex. We need you in the Senate. Rex, you'll remember, is a former submariner, so has a lived experience in submarines. He's been aboard nuclear subs and he knows the specifications needed for operational effectiveness. Greetings, Rex.
Thank you very much, Quentin.
Andrew, to you first. In Nuked, you follow the timeline forensically. You put us in the room with many of the players, the politicians and the bureaucrats and the defence officials. Now, we know the arms trade and its private contractors and consultants have a massive vested influence on governments and those politicians and bureaucrats procuring their lucrative partnerships and products. The Aukus saga abounds with conflicts of interest. I'm very cynical about that. I'm sure you are. But please tell us, what was the genesis of Aukus and the nuclear-propelled submarines idea when Australia, as you reveal, under Malcolm Turnbull as Prime Minister, had already told President Macron of France that we'd be contracting to buy French diesel electric subs, knowing that we could cost-effectively upgrade, if that's the right word, to nuclear propulsion because the French already produced the Barracuda nuclear-powered subs. What was the genesis of Aukus?
Look, the genesis of Aukus was to build and take part in the building of 12 non-nuclear submarines to patrol the approaching seaways around Australia, to protect Australia. To protect Australia, that was the main reason why we were replacing our Collins-class submarines, which were way over time and needed to be replaced. The way in which we went about that was, of course, a very Australian way. What we decided was that we actually wanted to build some of these submarines in Adelaide, and we needed to actually make sure they were built there. What happened is that the Prime Minister of the day at that time, Tony Abbott, decided that he actually didn't want to build them there. He wanted the Japanese submarines, because the Japanese submarines were favored by the Americans. And this goes really to the heart of the matter. This whole Aukus fiasco is about getting Australia closer to the United States. It's got little to do with the defense of Australia and everything to do with pleasing the Americans. We went for non-nuclear submarines when it was decided by the Abbott government to go for submarines. He went for the best thing he could get, which was non-nuclear submarines made by a country that's a close American ally. That's Japan. America itself does not make conventionally powered submarines. It makes only nuclear powered submarines. So we ended up going for nuclear submarines because of our desire to be close to the United States. They couldn't make non-nuclear submarines, so we had to have nuclear subs.
But Andrew, the Department of Defence and all our assessments, we had a merit assessment, and there were three shortlisted: Japan, France, and Germany. And on that merit assessment, France won clearly on all the criteria. Now, Rex, you did not support the French, which was awarded by Turnbull this contract. Why was that?
Yeah, look, I'm a big supporter of a flexible and capable defence force, a defence force that can do a whole range of different tasks in response to the requirements of the government and or the parliament. The difficulty I had with the French solution, and it wasn't because it was French, was that it was not an off-the-shelf design. Australia has persistently taken to defence projects that seek to get the best capability on paper and then sort of run these programs, bespoke programs, which are just fully laden with risk, when in actual fact you could go out and buy an off-the-shelf design. You can build those in Australia, but you know that it will work. And then you can HSV it, if you want to use a Holden term, you can HSV it to improve some of the capabilities on board of the submarine. But for me, the French program was just simply too risky. And to give you a bit of an idea, when the project was first proposed, the budget set was $50 million. The French solution turned out to be $90 billion. We've seen the same thing with the Hunter-class frigates, where that was supposed to be an off-the-shelf design. It wasn't. The frigate, the Hunter-class frigate, is not a ship that's at sea, and that went from 9 frigates for $30 billion to 9 frigates for $45 billion, and now it's 6 frigates for $45 billion. Just grossly expensive compared to simply going get it and getting a capability that works.
Okay, that was a cost motivation in your assessment at that time.
Cost and risk.
Let's just step back a bit to first principles, and this to you, Kellie. Do you accept that Australia has to have a high level of defence capability? We're now in an armaments race with autonomous drones, artificial intelligence transforming data analysis and communications, intercontinental and short-range missiles, iron domes, submersible drones, cyber attacks and counterattacks to disable infrastructure. Did you, and do you, Kellie, support a submarine capability as part of this country's defence preparedness?
Thanks, Quentin. Firstly, I'd say that the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists have placed the doomsday clock at 90 seconds to midnight. The new weapons you've mentioned have such destructive power, as we've witnessed in Gaza and Ukraine, that there will be no victor in any war. No one will get out of it what they want. Wars fought with modern weapons, often remotely, can destroy everything, anything that makes a society function. So neither Chinese hospitals nor our hospitals have the capacity to cope with mass casualties. So in fact, I issued an FOI request in 2022, covering the period immediately after the Albanese government was elected. And that was basically for information provided to the Minister for Defence about the estimates of the number of casualties, Australian casualties, in the event of a war between the US and China. And that was answered with no documents exist. So that reflects the true extent of our preparedness for war. Any avoidable military contest or conflict is folly. So secondly, as to the high level of defence capability and the armaments race, I would like to focus on the one of the strategies referred to in the defence strategy documents that underpins the Aukus decision. So you see it referenced in the Defence Strategic Update in 2020 and the Defence Strategic Review in 2023 and the National Defence Strategies. And that is deterrence by denial, or as the US refer to it, it's integrated defence by denial. So the premise is that the deterrence of denial requires showing an adversary, and let's say for argument's sake, China, that it would lose in a military contest. So the problem is that if that fails, the next step is war. So it invites war. The following this doctrine puts us on a war footing, and in a state of heightened readiness, everyone is deterring one another at huge expense to the societies involved, and it's enriching weapons manufacturers and politicians while people live in constant danger. So the doctrine invites progressively escalating deterrence until something or someone triggers open conflict. Then the amount invested in deterrence will almost guarantee the obliteration of all parties involved and quite possibly mankind, because the end game is unrestrained war between nuclear armed adversaries. So defence has never been questioned about the soundness of this strategy or its basic assumptions, and they've never been asked what happens if it fails. They've never been asked to show they've seriously considered alternative approaches, whether warfighting dominance is necessary or effective to prevent territorial aggression, or on what basis they believe China seeks regional hegemony. I do support the acquisition of capabilities necessary to defend the mainland of Australia, but it must be balanced with allocating funding to diplomacy, economic outreach, dealing with the consequences of climate change, and all of the other important expenditure really necessary for a well-functioning, educated and healthy society. I don't support the acquisition of capabilities designed to make us part of an unbroken chain of US sentinel states in order to encircle and intimidate China.
Well said. Yes, it's mad. Yeah, you win the point with me. But Andrew, what I got from your book, when Turnbull went with the French, and it became apparent that Abbott was undermining that from the get-go, you exposed that and all the intermediaries that were involved in that process. But what came out of it for me was that you exposed what was a realignment. If we'd gone with the French for a French India Australia realignment geopolitically, the French have got interests in the South Pacific as old colonialists, of course, which is a bit of a worry. But was that a legitimate? Exactly what did you discover? Can you just talk to us about that for a while?
Well, I mean, let's look at the recent statements of the Defence Minister, Richard Marles. He said we changed our position from interoperability with the United States to interchangeability, which means that we have now enmeshed ourselves completely in the American military, to the extent it's not just we just sort of move things around a bit. We can actually swap. It's the reason why we've gone with these American-made submarines, and British, if they ever manage to get their shipyards up to speed, which is very doubtful, before China invades or occupies Taiwan. But to really go to your question about the way that I saw the geographic plan unfolding, it looked to me, and I demonstrate it in the book, that the last thing the Americans wanted, and they were, by the way, completely in connivance with the Morrison government on this, to sink the French right from the moment that they were picked, along with the present head of, for a while anyway, of the Office of National Intelligence, Andrew Shearer, running this campaign against the French. And why did they do that? Because they know that the French have this terrible, terrible thing known as independence. And they go so far to have an independent nuclear deterrent, which, whether you like it or not, that's what they have, and they hold all their weapons on shore in France, or at least in French territory. So I think that one of the big issues that came out for me was that apart from obviously being slowly poisoned by somebody, was that France was being shut out because it didn't go into the Iraq war, because Macron excuse me, because Macron spoke very clearly about the threat of China and the non-threat of it, or the way in which to deal with it. He was quite outspoken. He talked of a new alliance between India and Australia and France, and didn't mention the United States. He talked of the Belt and Road as a new Silk Road, not as some sort of stalking horse for Chinese hegemony. You can imagine how well that went down in Washington. So the idea
all our diplomats, all the US diplomats in Australia, from the ambassador down, would have been ringing alarm bells in their briefing papers back to Washington.
Yeah, well, in fact, this is what came out afterwards when we learned that Biden, and we know that the senior executives of the Biden administration were absolutely hand in glove with the Australians in Washington. And we know that by statements that were made subsequently by the White House, but also we know at the time when the Australians went to talk in the Eisenhower building next to the White House and met with people like Kurt Campbell, sat down and talked about the nuclear options that they were talking about. The next day, the French went to see them, and they talked about the importance of the submarine project, and the Americans said nothing. They said, noted, well noted.
Well, does that mean that our American friends started this in saying, well, we've got to offer the Aussies something better?
Well, they started it because they wanted to, I think for the first time, something that from Menzies, Australia's been trying to do, drag Americans into Australia. They actually wanted to come this time because they needed Australia to pay for at least some of their weaponry. They needed Australia as being a locked-in base to, if you like, a backstop in case they lose Guam and the Philippines and the rest of it, and also to launch refueling for the B-52s and all that sort of added on stuff. So we became very important.
I'll get to the sovereignty issues that come from Australia becoming a US base shortly. But Rex, let's go to the Submariner here. If we accept that submarines must be part of the mix, what are the specifications we need? Isn't nuclear propulsion the best? Nuclear subs can stay underwater for months. The US-UK HEU, highly enriched uranium propulsion system, is said to last in one unit in a submarine for 35 years, therefore worth the cost, the extra money that Australia will have to invest with the US and the UK in this deterrence capability.
Look, I don't share the view that it's good value in any way, shape, or form. Obviously, you're always trying to work out what's the problem you're trying to solve as you seek to procure a submarine. But let me just tell you, having been to sea on conventional submarines, on air-independent propulsion submarines of both Greece and South Korea, and having been to sea on nuclear-powered submarines, namely the Los Angeles class submarines. Look, the reactor is simply a very powerful propulsion system. It's an infinite power supply. And what that allows a submarine to do, the two areas where that kicks into play, is when you're transiting. So you can take your submarine down to a couple of 100 meters and you can spin the speed up to 25 to 30 knots, and I'm being deliberately a little bit vague. And you can stay there, and that allows a submarine to get into an area very quickly. And when they get into the area, they then sit and watch exactly what's going on, doing what's called intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance of an area. They can also be deployed into those areas and then pulled out without ever raising any diplomatic tension, which is another useful attribute to them. And that's one of the attractions for Australia, is the ability to deploy across long distances. And there's a legitimate argument as to whether or not we need to do that. Do we need to get to the South China Sea? The second thing that is good about nuclear-powered submarines is the ability to use speed to get away from someone if you're detected. And that's another attribute of a nuclear-powered submarine. But I can flip that on its head a little bit and say that when I've been to sea on both conventional submarines and on air-independent propulsion submarines, when those submarines are running on either a fuel cell or alternatively a battery, they are deadly quiet compared to a nuclear-powered submarine, which always has to have the cooling pumps running, particularly for an attack class submarine. Always there's a really big set of gears that exist between the very high speed steam turbine and the propellers, so there's noise created by that. So there's an example where a conventional submarine may well be better, and indeed in shallow water, much better to have a smaller submarine. They're much more controllable, much more flexible. So it's a little bit like saying, what's the best car? And you sort of put the reactor forward and the speed element, and you're, Quentin, saying it's a Ferrari. But I might say to you, but what if I want to take the kids shopping? What if I want to go off road? So it depends on the task that you're trying to fulfill, whether or not that capability is, is key. And in my view, we can do 90% of all the things that our submarine force needs to do, including by way of having forward bases, using an off-the-shelf conventional, or actually more preferably an air-independent propulsion submarine. That costs, Singapore, they pay $600 million for their submarines. And they are extremely capable. I have been to sea on the Type 214 class submarines. They call them a Type 218 because 214 is a really bad number, means certain death in Chinese numbers. 218 is a much better number. So I've been to sea on those highly capable submarines. And again, this goes to, about balancing out the forces that we have. If we spent $30 billion buying 20 off-the-shelf AIP submarines, we create a situation where there are more places that an anti-submarine warfare commander on the other side has to think about. But more importantly, we have the ability to then spend $336 billion other dollars on fuel security, on industrial resilience, on a whole range of other different capabilities that can be used in a whole range of different scenarios, and then take some money off our national debt, and have, in my view, a much better capable defence force.
And the news today, Rex, is that Australia is going to be in deeper deficit for the foreseeable future. Kellie, you've been writing about this from your wonderful perspective. In your assessment, has the Australian public been moved, particularly when you look at our obligations on waste storage from having a nuclear propulsion submarine system? We're going to get on to the bases and sovereignty shortly, but has public opinion, I think the Resolve poll showed that 57% of our fellow Australians were opposed to AUKUS. Is the nuclear storage, waste storage an issue? And what do you perceive to be the biggest thing that is moving public opinion?
Well, the short answer is yes. The safe disposal or long-term storage of nuclear waste has been a perennial issue since nuclear power was devised. So it's unlike speculative potential benefits from nuclear subs. We know the dangers posed by nuclear waste, and we know they persist indefinitely. And has this been given appropriate weight by decision makers? I doubt it. And of course, we're assuming it's limited to just our nuclear waste. So buried in the vast outback, and AUKUS already has a disproportionate effect on First Nations people. So it's clear that First Nations people weren't being properly informed and consulted in their own language about the likely consequences of AUKUS on their land, sea, and communities, and their skies and customs. And Andrew's book reveals the level of secrecy, so we know they weren't properly consulted. So it's got that shades of atomic testing at Woomera after World War II, but they have not provided free, prior and informed consent to the militarism of their traditional lands, or for its use as a dumping ground for highly radioactive waste. So nuke subs use highly enriched weapons-grade uranium. I think there was a 730 report recently where Mark Butler referred to it as being something other than highly enriched. which it'll have to be kept deep underground and monitored for centuries. So weapons grade waste remains radioactive for about 20,000 years. And at the moment, we can't even agree on a permanent place to store low-level nuclear waste. So that is why traditional owners, I suspect, will and have every right to be upset, and hopefully will contest legislation that declares the Osborne Shipyard and HMS Stirling Naval Base near Perth.
Well, thank you. This is we're in a cost of living crisis in Australia, and Julie Mackin has posted a question. Does the panel have any thoughts on why in the midst of this crisis, the people appear to be unconcerned, although I've just quoted that 57% number, unconcerned about a $368 billion bill for subs we may get or may not get in a few decades. Andrew, does that move you? Are you surprised?
Well, Quentin, I was deeply moved by many things I discovered. The first time when I turned on the telly and I watched the three prime ministers, or president, two prime ministers, up there on the rostrum breaking the flags around them, I was wondering what was going to come. What I really wasn't expecting was a $368 billion bill for something that we might not get. And what we learned subsequent to that is that even if we don't get them, we may not get, or we won't get the money back. There's no guarantee in the contract according to the Senate investigation that's been carried out. So I'm horrified by the amount of money. When you look at the way the French boat was treated, and it was either 50 or 80 billion or 90 billion, however you want to count it, that was for 12 submarines that could do the job for Australia. And somehow we can spend $368 billion and nobody asks a question about it. When, as you say, and as Rex pointed out earlier, the budget's in tatters and people are in a cost of living crisis. I'm surprised that Aukus has even got as many percentage support as you mentioned earlier.
Rex, why did Albanese, our current Prime Minister, and Andrew covers it in his book, The Sting, why was he so easily wedged by Morrison when he gave him 24 hours, less than 24 hours notice of his announcement with Boris Johnson and Joe Biden?
Look, Anthony Albanese was running a low-risk strategy, a low-target strategy to get to election. And so he didn't want to have a big argument over defence. And so he simply went along with the idea. And as Andrew's revealed, without any real consultation with his own party. That's basically the reason he put his own election ahead of public good or good public.
I think everybody can understand that, Rex, but why didn't... I suppose the way to do it now with the limited time is that Trump's going to be in the White House from the 20th of January. All our diplomats, Kevin Rudd, everybody's starting to say, Aukus will survive a Trump presidency. But with Albanese and Miles locking Australia in to AUKUS and the first tranche of contracts going out, there's reporting today that one consultancy, McKinsey, is being questioned because of Chinese connections. The question is there any way out for Australia on the question of the inordinate cost of this, let alone the sovereignty questions? Rex?
Well, the first way out was with it when Albanese got in and was presented with a bill for $368 billion. That should have been the point at which he and the cabinet said, hey, guys, we've got a significant problem ahead of us as we see the economic forecast, as we try and understand reducing our exports and reliance on oil and gas royalties. We're going to see some trouble moving ahead. This is a hugely economically risky program. So there were opportunities to pull out, and indeed, really, a government can do that at any time, and that has happened in other jurisdictions based on the cost. We could simply have a cold, hard look at what's going on, and if Defence were actually prepared to do this, and they've demonstrated an unwillingness to do this, You would simply look to the prospects of the United States Navy being able to actually supply us with a submarine. That's in considerable doubt now, just so everyone understands, in order to meet the US Navy's own requirements for a Columbia ballistic missile submarine program that they've got running, and the Virginia-class program they've got running, and the Aukus submarines that they intend to transfer to Australia, they have to hit a build rate of 2.3 submarines per annum. Right now, and since 2022, the US has only been able to achieve 1.2 to 1.4. And indeed, next year in their budget, they're only budgeting for one submarine. And there were reports out even today saying that there are 3 other submarines that are running late. It's almost impossible to see how the US government will lift that production rate up to the 2.3. And what that means is when we get to 2033, 34, and there's the transfer is due, the United States Navy, the United States Congress, in the legislation that was passed about this time last year, has made it such that in order for the transfer of any submarine to Australia to occur, there must be a certification from the US president that the transfer will not harm US national security interests or US foreign policy interests. Now, that can mean anything to anyone, but I can't see the United States Navy, who would be advising the president, saying, let's give these submarines to Australia in circumstances where they are behind in their own needs. And you
report in Michael West Media today, Rex, that I think you might have alluded to it, that the Virginia class budget is 17 billion in the US, is 17 billion over budget, quite apart from the complete discrediting of their momentum to deliver 2+ Virginia class each year.
Any serious project manager, and I am a former project manager, would always look to the risks associated with the project. And the cabinet are blind to the risks, and so too are the senior naval officers. I wouldn't take a project manager and say, I want you to be the commander of a submarine. Likewise, you don't take the commander of a submarine or a warship and say, I'm going to make you a project manager. It just doesn't happen like that. But that's exactly what goes on. And so time and time again, we see defence admirals, generals, and air marshals who have very little project management experience making recommendations on procurement to cabinet ministers who have no project management experience. And there's no reality or even consequence for the Albanese government in terms of what happens in 2035, because at that stage in 2035, in terms of Albanese, we'll be reading the second edition of his autobiography that we've taken from the discount bin of a bookstore. There will be no accountability for Richard Marles or for Albo. It'll all just bear down to
They could do a John Howard and say this was the advice I had at the time.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it's always the Australians. At that stage, we will have invested $5 billion in the US shipbuilding industry if Trump doesn't make us pay more, plus a whole raft of other costs. And we'll end up in a situation where we simply don't get a submarine. And that's for a capability that defence and indeed the Prime Minister has said is a most important capability. There is no plan B here. They're just living on hope that the United States will somehow get to the point where they're making 2.3 submarines, and that's just not realistic.
Is there any way out of this for Australia? Because we're locked in. Both the Lib Nats and the Labor Party and their cabinet and their parliamentary party, although there's Labor branches are opposing it, particularly after Keating, I think Gareth Evans and Bob Carr have started to cut up rough about it. Is there any way out of this?
Well, can I just say that, you mentioned my opposition to the French submarines, and again, that was on risk and cost. I spent a lot of time inside the parliament, and I was the person people would come to if they wanted an opinion. And it didn't matter whether they were Labor or Liberal. You know, as we know from it was revealed in Andrew's book. You know, Barnaby Joyce contacted me and said, "I want to talk to you about nuclear-powered submarines, Rex." And so you know, there's some adult supervision required inside the parliament where I can, you know, someone like me can talk to other members of parliament and just explain the reality of the situation. Of course, we can always walk away, and we can walk away now on the basis that the United States itself is not confident that it can deliver. The Congressional Research Service is now putting up other options that might need to replace the transfer of submarines. There is
Rex, we're not going to get there before the 2025 election. I'm an old political reporter, and
sure, no, absolutely not.
Sure, Andrew, is there any way out of this?
Well, look, I think the answer is simply a middle course on this, if you like, Quentin, and it's this. It's that the Americans, Chuck Schumer, Senate leader, and Kurt Campbell, who's now major security advisor, was the Asia czar now with Biden in his final days in the White House, they both said it doesn't matter about the delivery of the submarines to Australia, because even if we give them the submarines, they won't be lost to America. In other words, there'll be American submarines no matter what. So that's a devastating conclusion, if you like, out of the mouths of the senior leadership of the Biden administration, who were very worried about delivering the nuclear subs to themselves and very worried about having to give 3 or more to Australia. But then the statement is, well, it doesn't matter because they'll be in our group anyway. So we'll be in lockstep with the Americans on whatever they do.
We are locked in. I think that's the awful conclusion. We're working, as you've indicated in your book, on the interoperability with the Japanese military in joint operations in the Northern Territory. We're reconciled with Japan after the Second World War. It's now a close ally. Sovereignty is a wonderful myth. I'll put it to the panelists. Sovereignty in this in the era of Ukraine and the geopolitics and the what Mike Pizzullo calls the Eurasian counterbalance of that's Russia and China against the West. We are locked in. There's no way out of this. Where does that leave Australia's sovereignty? It's a myth. We cannot possibly have sovereign independence in this situation. Kellie.
Well, just going back to your previous question, one thing I would add is that we actually haven't seen the terms of the Aukus agreement. It's never been released publicly. I suspect there won't be any easy outers, but it's a bit hard to answer the question about whether or not we can walk away when they haven't made that document public. I did issue an FOI for that document. 5 documents.
Well, we're not cabinet, we're not security cleared.
Correct.
It's all secret. That's what this is called.
Exactly.
The public doesn't know.
But I mean, with such a huge expenditure, one would think we would be entitled to see what the Aukus arrangement is.
And the parliamentary oversight committees are also go in camera. They're in camera briefed by the security agencies. The public doesn't get a see. The oversight committees don't report with any degree of frankness to the Australian public. But my question, Kellie,
about sovereignty. Yeah, sure. So
is sovereignty a myth because we are now in a much more dangerous situation worldwide?
Well, I think it's true that much of Australia's warfighting capability is not self-sufficient. So we can't maintain operational readiness in our own right. So the F-35 is a classic example. It requires software updates and an information exchange with the United States. So parts and supplies come from US-led consortium. So, and I note there was recently a Government Accountability Office report that found that the F-35 sustainment was, the costs were rising and the availability had decreased. So costing more and doing less. Australia has shaped its defence policy to be compatible with the US foreign strategic and defence policy and US force structures. There's no doubt about that. All are designed to be compatible with US forces when we operate beside them and in whatever theatre of conflict and war the US decides is essential for maintaining the international rules-based order. So, but there is space for hard diplomatic work, and I think that's what's missing. Australia can build opportunities for collaboration, fostering long-term peace, and help to establish non-aligned mechanisms that will work, will link major Western and non-Western powers, which will give a voice to countries that want to seek to moderate some of those US-China tensions. But on the upside, I think in the United States, we've got Elon Musk, who does business with China. The intelligence community is reeling over the appointment of Tulsi Gabbard. John Bolton's losing his mind, which probably suggests she's a good appointment. And she's a dove rather than a hawk, and she sounds terrible because she wants a cooperative approach moving forward with China, and she's against regime change wars, and she wants congressional approval of military action. So it's no wonder the intelligence community is reeling. But and there's Trump's chief of staff, Susie Miles. She's a 67-year-old woman who has been a lobbyist in the past, and she's had Chinese clients. So there are cool heads surrounding an unpredictable president. And I think there is space for positivity and diplomacy.
Thank you, Andrew. In this game, sorry to say that word, but isn't this the price we have to pick a side? You list in your book the interoperability we've already got. We can call it interoperability. Sure. We've already got with our American friend, with Pine Gap to Sterling to Tyndall to the US Marine Base. We've got B-52s. In Northwest Cape, I mentioned the Japanese. Where does this leave Australia's sovereignty? You answer that question. There's no way out. We have to pick a side.
Well, I must say, Quentin, I do disagree with you. I don't think we have to pick a side. I believe that we should do as Des Ball, the former head of strategic studies at the ANU, said before he passed away, a great strategic thinker. He said he thought Pine Gap should be shut down because he thought it made Australia a target that it didn't need to be. And as Sam Rogerveen, who was formerly with the ONA, now ONI, and now works for Lowy, said in his very, very good book, The Akita, he said that Beijing is closer to Berlin than it is to Sydney. Why is it that we seem to be obsessed with joining every single American war that it gets involved in without question? And I think the independence and the sovereignty comes from a position of your mind, the way politically that we look at the dangers, the opportunities and the dangers of being so close to the United States. And I think it's about time we had a debate about what our strategic alliance should be. You've got Indonesia off the coast, looking at the non-aligned movement. You've got India that's not strategically aligned. There's a whole raft of areas you could move in, but we just seem to be in lockstep with the Americans because of the old days. And so far, the wars they fought have hardly been glorious, apart from coming in very late into the Second World War.
They've been follies. Australians love Americans because they helped to save us from Japanese invasion, but they've been follies ever since, from Korea to Iraq to Afghanistan to Vietnam. Yeah. Earlier on. I think that's well established now, but not necessarily broadly in the Australian mind. Alison Granovsky says, what say will Australia have about the weapons the US brings into bases here, including the potential for nuclear-armed missiles, nuclear-armed submarines? What are they to be used for? Maybe that's a question of our sovereignty. Like the New Zealanders don't allow nuclear-propelled submarines there. We will allow nuclear-propelled submarines here, and quite soon, if not already. What say will Australians have about the deployment of these weapons from Australia? Rex?
Look, I think the answer, particularly in relation to things like nuclear weapons, is we just simply have a don't ask policy. So we don't request knowledge as to whether a B-52 transiting through Australia, operating out of Australia, has those weapons. Although often you can tell by the number of US Marines that are around. Look, when you look at the totality of everything that's happening, and Andrew sort of mentions in his book, HMAS Sterling with the nuclear-powered submarines, Harold E. Holt, the submarine communication station, Tyndall, Darwin, Pine Gap. We're putting in logistics now in Victoria and Queensland to allow us to support United States forces. So we are really well and truly embedded in their plans. That's a choice that someone has made, and it's unlikely that that officials are going to ask too many questions about what weapons do or don't come into the country as a result of US forces operating out of here.
Hey, listen, if Trump cuts up rough on tariffs with his American promises, and that impacts on Australia, would that be a potential for the government and the people of Australia to reconsider the alliance and in particular AUKUS? Andrew?
Yeah, I think that anybody that deals with Donald Trump needs to be as big a bully as he is, and they want Australia in the tent for the first time ever since Menzies and following on his love child John Howard have just tried to get the Americans in with B-52s and the rest of it, build it up. I think if now the tables have turned and now the Americans want our space, they really want Australia. The tariff card, if you think it's worth playing, you play it up against the AUKUS deal and say, look, we're just not getting anywhere. You're not guaranteeing the subs. You say they're going to use them. You'll be using them anyway. We'll be paying for them. It's a question of our sovereignty and our dignity. So, with all due respect, President, the answer is no. And I think you have to play sometimes that harder game. It's like Australia's is in quite a strong position, as vulnerable as it is at the moment. It's in a very strong position, particularly on the argument with Trump coming into the White House. And don't forget that Trump has also threatened to obliterate Afghanistan and irradiate North Korea. And he's got a big red button on his desk, bigger than the North Korean leader. I mean, this is the sort of nonsense politics we're dealing with. And we need to try to disconnect ourselves from what might be this madness and build stronger relationship with China, which is really what this government's doing in a very cautious way, because it's terrified of being seen as weak on China, because it might upset the Americans.
Well, Albo's got one foot either side of the barbed wire fence, as they say. Let me ask you all straight out, because Australians have been reading and hearing of the growing threat from China for years now. Kellie, maybe to you first. Departing Ambassador Caroline Kennedy said AUKUS was justified. Just look at China's ramming Philippines Coast Guard vessels, the artificial islands it's now built in the South China Sea, its intimidation of the Vietnamese fishing grounds, its missiles fired over Taiwan and towards Japan. Do you accept that China is being unnecessarily aggressive with its own massive military buildup, giving our intelligence agencies, which is their job, the intelligence agencies, just cause to advise our Australian government to prepare for war?
Well, it's a good question. I think the reference to Taiwan, I'm not sure if she was referring to the August 22 firing of missiles after Nancy Pelosi had visited Taiwan in a very provocative act. But I think our intelligence agencies actually do, and analysts confuse, perhaps deliberately, military preparedness with war preparation. And there was evidence given to US-China Economic and Security Review Commission in June 2024, Timothy Heath from RAND Corporation. And he makes that point, that analysts cite evidence of Chinese war preparations, but in reality, military preparedness is the breadth of their activity. So states undertake this to ensure its military can carry out any and all of these missions that are assigned to it, even in peacetime. So this includes investments in and development of new weapons and technology and equipment. So military preparedness is actually a normal activity undertaken regardless of whether a country's leadership believes a war is likely or not. And he looked at what the society is doing in China. He said obviously Xi's speeches about Taiwan and reunification are a low priority. It's mentioned at the end of his speeches. There's no public desire for any confrontation with Taiwan, and that's echoed in polls in Taiwan and the United States. Its defence expenditure is about 2% of GDP. It might be a little bit underreported. And he asserts, obviously, that the stockpiling may in fact be related to an unstable, unpredictable global economy. So there's no public enthusiasm for war. Surveys have found that China has expressed little support for armed conflict to compel Taiwan's unification. Like most rising powers, China is increasing its military expenditure, and its focus, it seems to me, is on sovereign territorial integrity, which all countries focus on. So there's no threat to navigation. The problem is the exclusive economic areas, which I'm sure Rex will talk about. There are problems in the South China Sea, and they can be resolved diplomatically and with superior diplomacy. So we have to improve the military-to-military communication with China, and the US and China need to negotiate some sort of common understanding about the maritime freedoms and prohibitions. And the United States, of course, is not a signatory to the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, but China is. So there is just, analysts talk about China as if it's preparing for war, without making that distinction of what is acceptable and normal in terms of military preparedness. And I think that's something that gets lost in the debate, and not enough questions get asked about that.
Sure. To Rex first. Sorry, Andrew, you want to say something?
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing is to look at, to try to look at it from a China perspective. And I think that if you look at it from a China perspective, you might wonder why they want those islands in those sea channels. And it's because they learned the lessons of war that the Americans have waged around the world, and they know that keeping the sea channels open is really important for survival. Why is the nuclear base on the west coast of Australia? It's not because we like the Indian Ocean, it's because we can go straight up the coast of China and cut their oil supplies. So it's that they're worried about being boxed in. They're worried about a containment policy to strangle them. So that's another argument which I never read in the Australian press. And I think it's a thing worth looking at. And I am by no means a supporter of authoritarian regimes. I would not support the authoritarian regime that Donald Trump's about to introduce. And we should also talk about that in the future when we're talking about authoritarianism and democracy, which we probably won't talk about, but it should be talked about earlier on. So China's position is understandable. I don't see them making some great strategic leap even for Taiwan in the short term, and for Australia landing on the beaches of Darwin, or all the scare stories that ran, the appalling scare stories that ran, which softened us up for Aukus. Here's the problem.
Red alert. The old Fairfax masthead's great contribution to this debate. Rex,
it was appalling. I mean, it was just rotten, because there was a far more interesting story there, and it wasn't done.
Look, I don't want to frighten the horses, but maybe I can bring it to a point this way. But to each of you and to our audience watching this webinar, should Australia join the United States in a war with China over Taiwan? I'm posed this question because I'm worried that with Trump in the White House, Putin will take Ukraine, and that will change the geopolitics, what Mike Pizzullo calls the Eurasian threat to the West, as we call it. Should Australia join the United States in a war with China over Taiwan? Rex.
Look, we're talking from an organisation that is of the view that these sorts of decisions should be made by Parliament, and in some sense should be made by Parliament at the time and in relation to the circumstances. I'm a little bit sympathetic to the idea that there are 22 million, or I think it might be slightly more than that, Taiwanese who live in a democratic country and may be under threat. So there is some cause to say that we should give some support, not so much to the United States, but to the Taiwanese people. That is a decision that should be made at some future time by the Parliament. What I will say is, again, if you have a highly capable and flexible defence force, then you have the option of assisting in a number of different ways. If we have an all eggs in one basket solution, which is what AUKUS is, then there's only one way in which we can contribute. To me, that's a hugely problematic situation. I like the idea that it doesn't matter what's occurring in our region. If our defence force is flexible, capable, diverse in terms of its capabilities, then we can contribute as the Parliament wishes for that to occur. Unfortunately, AUKUS locks us in to a pathway that maybe some future government doesn't want to be involved in, some future Parliament doesn't want to be involved in.
Thank you. Just quickly, Andrew, should Australia join a war with China, with the US over Taiwan?
I think that's a question that, as Rex has said, should be answered at the time. I think it's very different from Ukraine. I think Ukraine's a much more open and shut case of a country. This is not a country; it's ill-determined sovereignty. I would say that we may not have the opportunity to decide, which is my major fear. In other words, it won't be a question of whether or not we're going to decide to join.
It'll be Menzies or Albo or Dutton, My Melancholy Duty. We're at war with China.
No, we'll join it because the Americans will start a war and we will be a victim of it. And that's the problem. Our greatest threat comes, in my opinion, not from China, but being very closely allied to a regime that's about to enter Washington, which may be completely crazy and really dangerous.
We should project independence. Kellie?
Well, I think the Australian government, any Australian government's job should be to try and support China and the United States compete peacefully. I think the other thing is our defence analysts need to be a little bit honest when they write reports suggesting that China hasn't indicated what its strategic intent is and hasn't provided strategic reassurance. We know that there was a joint statement in 1972 when they said, we will never be a superpower and it opposes hegemony and power politics of any kind. Now, that was a long time ago, but it did release another white paper in 2019, which says exactly the same. It wasn't widely reported. I think the ABC had one news item about it, but it was to try and calm people down about their strategic intent. And they repeated what they'd said in 1972, is that they will never seek hegemony, expansion, or spheres of influence. And of course, the public remains uninformed about that. So China has been remarkably consistent. There's no evidence that China has had any plan to take Taiwan by force, and as a result would have a hegemonic appetite if it did take Taiwan by force. So I think the contest is foolish and will merge. There's no off-ramp once conflict spills over.
Paul Keating and Gareth Evans and the others agree with you. Just quickly, we're done. Thanks so much, you guys, for your insights and wisdom. Can Australia remain an ally of the United States without giving away our sovereignty? Rex?
Look, I think we've done that in the past, perhaps not as well as what we might have liked. I don't have any issues with us allying with the United States, partnering with Indonesia, working with India. I just think we should do that on terms that we are comfortable with. And again, that comes down to having your own capable forces and making decisions around cooperation and coalitions that might be sent out to do something in accordance with our national interests at the time. I think that's a realistic proposition.
Well, I hope Ambassador Kennedy's monitoring this webinar. Kellie? Can we
So
start
I would
with
say,
the Yanks?
yeah, no, I'd say no. And that's on the basis that the US won't commit it. They have the underlying philosophy that you're either with us or against us. And I think they will press that point, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try even in difficult circumstances.
Well, that's my point. That we're good mates. You should be able to say to your mate, "This is no good. We're not going to do that." Andrew.
Yeah, I mean, I think mateship's an overused word in this country. I don't know about.
Well, it's used by our diplomats, mate.
Well, it may well be. It's even used by the Prime Minister, who talks of going halvesies and things like that, which I was kind of surprised to hear. The problem you have with AUKUS is that it sucks billions and billions of dollars out of the military and puts it into one place, which is the eggs in one basket argument that Rex puts up. And that means that we are less and less able to operate independently because we're running down the rest of our military operations to feed this beast. And on top of that, we won't even control the submarines because we haven't got the crews to do it. And also the Americans, if they give them to us, will say they're theirs anyway. I mean, that's the position we're in. And the question is, how on earth did we end up in this mess? And how much worse would it be in the future unless we solve the fundamental problems of acquisitions, not only in defence, but elsewhere, but particularly defence, because it's completely and utterly out of control.
Can I just interrupt just to end
yes,
this?
Rex.
You could have just shortened that with the first part of your sentence, which said the problem with AUKUS is that it sucks.
Well,
Thanks,
that's not very funny in a cost of living crisis and fear of war. Kellie Tranter, Rex Patrick, Andrew Fowler, thanks very much for participating in this webinar. All the best.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben.